I watched my boss tear open the envelope, smile, and say my name out loud. Then he looked at me, folded the tickets back inside, and said, "I'll take these." Everyone laughed. I smiled too. Inside, something went completely silent. I had earned those Super Bowl tickets the hard way, 6 months of 70-hour weeks. Sleeping in my car between client meetings. Fixing disasters that weren't mine to fix. The incentive was clear: top performer gets 2 tickets. Travel and Clear sent the email. My name was at the top. When my boss, Mark, called me into the conference room, I thought he was going to congratulate me. Instead, he closed the door, leaned back in his chair, and said, "I've decided I deserve them more." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even blink. I just nodded and said, "Of course, enjoy the game." That surprised him more than anger ever could. He expected resistance. Maybe tears. Maybe a complaint. Instead, I walked out quietly, carrying nothing but a thought I didn't share with anyone. Mark loved confidence. But what he loved more was control. The office knew what happened. You could feel it in the air, pity mixed with fear. No one spoke up. That was Mark's real power. He didn't need to threaten people. He just reminded them who signed their paychecks. The week after he took the tickets, Mark became unbearable. Louder, smugger, he mentioned the Super Bowl in every meeting, talked about the seats, the view, the exclusive lounge. Each word felt intentional, like he was pressing a bruise to see if I'd flinch. I didn't. Instead, I started paying attention. Mark was careless in ways most bullies are. He took shortcuts. He blurred lines. He treated company resources like personal toys. Quiet things. Things no one noticed because they were too busy surviving. I noticed everything. I began arriving earlier than usual, staying later, not to work harder but to listen, to observe patterns, to understand how Mark moved when he thought no one was watching. I learned that the Super Bowl trip wasn't just a perk. He was billing parts of it as a client development expense. Flights, hotel, premium seating, all charged to an account that wasn't meant for personal rewards. I didn't confront him. I didn't warn anyone. I did something much simpler. I documented every email, every approval, every expense report. I organized them neatly. Quietly, patiently. I didn't rush. Rushed revenge is sloppy. Sloppy revenge fails. Mark trusted me. That was the twist he never saw coming. I was quiet, reliable, the one who took it well. 2 weeks before the Super Bowl, the company announced an internal audit. Routine, they said. Random. Mark didn't panic. Why would he? Had survived worse. He joked about it in the break room. Told people audits were just paper games. The day the auditors arrived, Mark was in a great mood. He wore a tailored suit and bragged about his upcoming trip. He even stopped by my desk and said, "You sure you don't mind missing the game?" I smiled. Not at all. It was. The audit took 3 days. On the 4th, Mark was called into a closed-door meeting, then another. His laughter disappeared first, then his confidence, then his voice. By Friday, words spread slowly like cold air seeping under a door. Misuse of company funds, ethics violations, false expense categorization. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal. Just enough to end a career built on arrogance. Mark didn't get fired immediately. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he was placed on administrative leave, the kind that never ends well. The Super Bowl came and went. The tickets were flagged during the audit. The expenses frozen, the trip canceled, non-refundable. On Monday, HR sent out another email. A revised recognition announcement, top performer. Outstanding contribution, a formal apology for internal oversight. They asked if I still wanted the tickets for next year. I declined, not because I was bitter, but because I had already won. Mark cleared out his office quietly a few weeks later. No speech, no farewell email, just a cardboard box and eyes that never met mine. As he passed my desk, he stopped. For a moment, it looked like he wanted to say something. Ask me, beg me instead. He nodded, the same nod I had given him. I returned it. I never told anyone what I did. I didn't need credit. Revenge doesn't need an audience. It needs timing. People think power comes from taking things from others. It doesn't. Power comes from letting someone believe they've won, right up until the moment their own choices take everything away. Weeks passed. The office rhythm changed subtly. People whispered in corners, careful not to be overheard. Mark's absence was more than noticeable. It was a shadow looming over the team. But no one dared to mention the reason. Most didn't even understand it fully. It wasn't scandalous enough to talk about openly, but it was visible enough to shake confidence. I stayed quiet as usual. I smiled politely, nodded in meetings, and kept delivering work that no one could question. Some people assumed I was lucky. Some assumed I was compliant. But they had no idea how much patience it took to watch a predator like Mark dismantle himself, step by step, without a word from me. One morning, I received a call from HR. They wanted to discuss career development opportunities. My mind didn't race. I didn't panic. I already knew the meeting would be about the audit. My meticulous record-keeping, under pressure, I nodded, as if the call was routine. In the HR office, I was greeted by 2 people I respected. No dramatic fanfare, no exaggerated gestures. Just calm faces, business-like tones. They explained how the audit had exposed financial mismanagement, breaches of company ethics, and a general pattern of exploitation. They didn't accuse me of anything, but they gave credit where it was due. Someone had kept accurate records. Someone had been patient enough to document everything. Someone had made sure the truth came out. I smiled faintly and said nothing beyond a polite thank you. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the satisfaction of watching someone's arrogance unravel, because they never respected the quiet intelligence of the person they underestimated. Mark, meanwhile, had become a ghost in the office. No one knew if he was consulting with lawyers planning a comeback or quietly spiraling into paranoia. He never approached me. His silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. Every glance he threw in my direction was quick, hesitant, as if he feared that his shadow might be exposed. Months passed, the office atmosphere shifted. Teams began to respect diligence over charisma, integrity over arrogance. And quietly, I became an unspoken symbol of that change. People started coming to me for advice. Not because I demanded it, not because I boasted, but because I had proven that strategy and patience mattered more than loudness and ego. Then came the unexpected twist. One afternoon, a colleague handed me a small envelope. Inside was a set of tickets, not for the Super Bowl, but for a smaller, equally prestigious industry event. Alongside it, a note for demonstrating patience, intelligence, and resilience. Enjoy this, you've earned it. No signature, no fanfare, just acknowledgement. The kind that doesn't need applause. I smiled, tucked the envelope into my desk drawer, and let it sit there for a week before even opening it. I didn't rush to claim a reward. I wasn't interested in a public victory. I was satisfied knowing that patience and strategy had already paid off. Meanwhile, Mark attempted a quiet comeback in the industry, but every meeting, every negotiation, was shadowed by the reputation that had preceded him. Stories of his arrogance and the subtle but undeniable way he lost control circulated. In every conference room, behind closed doors, his name was mentioned with a tone of caution, a silent warning. People remembered that it wasn't just incompetence that led to his downfall. It was underestimating the silent observer. I continued my work quietly, observing patterns, learning more about human behavior, and understanding the psychology of those who believed control could only be taken by force. It was not about retaliation anymore, it was about mastery. Mastery of timing, patience, and observation. Mastery of knowing that power is rarely gained through noise, it is claimed in silence. One evening, months after the Super Bowl incident, I was asked to lead a major project with high visibility. The project required delicate negotiations with difficult clients, strategic planning, and careful delegation. I led without ego, without needing to dominate the room. My colleagues followed because they trusted judgment over bravado, intelligence over theatrics. Mark, by contrast, had become irrelevant to the current landscape. His presence was remembered only as a cautionary tale. And I, the quiet observer, the patient strategist, had moved past him entirely. The revenge wasn't about celebration or showing off. It was about being untouchable, respected, and ultimately free from the influence of someone who had once sought to belittle me. The lesson was clear. Revenge isn't about retaliation, it isn't about anger or spectacle. It is about strategy, patience, and timing. It is about letting someone expose their own weaknesses, about ensuring that arrogance meets its natural consequence without the need for aggression. I often reflect on that day in the conference room. The way Mark smiled, assuming victory. The way I nodded, saying nothing but meaning everything. That moment of restraint was far more powerful than any outburst could have been. It was proof that intelligence, composure, and observation are forces more enduring than anger. People who witness subtle, calculated revenge often fail to recognize it in real time. They underestimate the silent player in the room. They assume compliance is weakness. They don't realize that true power is exercised invisibly. Patiently and meticulously. Even now I sometimes see Mark at industry events. He is cordial, professional, but distant. There's no confrontation, no desire for conflict. The subtle humiliation lingers, but quietly. Because it doesn't need to be broadcast. Victory does not require applause. It requires proof. Proof that patience, intelligence, and strategy are more potent than brashness or entitlement. And every time I think back to those tickets, to that moment of betrayal, I smile. Not because I hold grudges, but because I understand the deeper game. Life often rewards the patient, the silent, the observant. It punishes the arrogant, the careless, and those who underestimate the quiet strength of others. The final truth is simple, cold, and unforgettable. Power is not taken. Power is proven, silently, patiently, and with perfect timing. The weeks after the audit felt like walking through a fog. Everything was clear, yet nothing was loud. The office had settled into a new rhythm. People still whispered about Mark, but not out of fear. They whispered in awe of how quietly someone had orchestrated a downfall without confrontation. I stayed silent as always. My desk was orderly, my work impeccable. Every day I watched human behavior, tiny gestures, fleeting glances. The hesitation before someone spoke. That was my world now: observation, patience, strategy. One afternoon I noticed something unusual. A junior manager, Rachel, seemed tense. She was brilliant but cautious, and she had a way of avoiding eye contact whenever Mark's name came up, even months after he was gone. Curiosity didn't take over me. Observation did. I started making small gestures, a nod, a smile, a question about her work. Slowly, Rachel began opening up. "I can't believe what happened with Mark," she whispered one day, leaning over my desk. He thought he could get away with anything." I nodded slightly. Power often blinds people. They think control is permanent. Her eyes widened, as if she'd never heard anyone articulate the truth like that. You stayed quiet. You didn't fight him. You didn't even argue. And yet he lost everything. Sometimes, winning doesn't need noise. It needs patience. She looked at me, almost reverently, and I realized that my influence had begun to extend quietly. I didn't demand respect. I earned it without announcing it. That I knew was far more powerful. A week later, a new challenge arrived at a high-stakes client negotiation that could make or break the company's next quarter. I was assigned as lead negotiator. Mark would have roared, demanded the spotlight, and bullied others into submission. I didn't need to roar. I didn't need the spotlight. The day of the meeting, I arrived early. The boardroom smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. The client's representatives were already there, discussing logistics with the legal team. I took a seat, calmly reviewing notes, observing body language, noting subtle power plays. When the meeting began, I spoke softly, almost conversationally. I asked questions that seemed innocuous but revealed the client's priorities. I listened more than I spoke. When I presented solutions, they were tailored, strategic, and flawless. By the end of the 2-hour meeting, the client was leaning forward, nodding, smiling. They shook hands, thanking me personally. They didn't just agree to our proposal, they trusted me. They trusted strategy, composure, and insight over noise and arrogance. Meanwhile, Mark, if he had been in that room, would have tried to dominate, to control, to bully. Instead, the people who once feared him now respected quiet intelligence. And the lesson of patience and strategy continued silently, in every corner. Weeks later, a subtle twist appeared. One of Mark's old allies in the company tried to reclaim influence. He was loud, confident, and manipulative, the classic mimicry of Mark's old tactics. He approached me with a smile. "I hear you've been doing well," he said, voice oily. "But don't you think someone like me could handle these clients faster?" I looked at him quietly. My expression was calm, almost different perhaps. But speed isn't the same as precision, and confidence without insight is often dangerous. He bristled, unsure if I was praising him or warning him. That pause, that moment of hesitation, was the same moment Mark had lost months ago. History, I realized, could repeat itself for anyone arrogant enough to underestimate the silent observer. I decided not to confront him further. I let the consequences unfold naturally. Within weeks, errors began surfacing in his reports. Overlooked deadlines, mismanaged communications. His credibility slipped quietly without a single word from me. The office watched, wide-eyed but silent. The lesson was clear: arrogance unchecked always betrays itself. Meanwhile, life outside the office continued. Friends asked about my own life: Super Bowl tickets, the lost reward, the humiliation. I would smile faintly and say some victories are quieter than others. But they last longer. No one understood fully, and that was the point. True revenge doesn't need spectators. It thrives in subtlety, patience, and strategic timing. Then came the ultimate confirmation of the plan's perfection. One afternoon, HR called me to a small meeting. I walked in, calm as ever. The atmosphere was different, expectation hung in the air, but it wasn't tension. "We want to recognize your contribution," Shar said, sliding a small envelope across the table. Inside were tickets, not for the Super Bowl, but for an exclusive industry gala. Alongside it was a note, "For demonstrating patience, intelligence, and leadership. You've earned it without shouting, without conflict. Enjoy what others could not even see coming." I smiled faintly, letting the envelope sit unopened for a moment. The recognition was symbolic, yes, but it was the validation of a larger truth: control and strategy outweigh aggression and arrogance. Mark's name was never mentioned in that room. His downfall was silent. My victory was quiet. But in every hallway, in every whispered conversation, in every cautious glance at someone who underestimated me, the message had spread. Weeks later, I walked past Mark at an industry conference. He was polished, professional, but the shadow of that past mistake lingered. His eyes met mine briefly, no words passed, but the weight of history hung in that moment. The humiliation wasn't public, it didn't need to be, but it was absolute. I walked away calmly, shoulders straight, mind clear. I didn't gloat, I didn't smirk. Revenge, I realized, is strongest when it's invisible, when it's never announced, and when it's completed before anyone realizes what happened. Years later, I would remember that day with the tickets, the conference room, and the quiet nod that started it all. The lesson stayed with me always. Observe, wait, let arrogance expose itself. Never underestimate the silent strategist. People think revenge is loud, dramatic, and chaotic. It isn't. True revenge is calculated, it is patient, it is unseen until the result is undeniable. And as I sat quietly, watching my colleagues succeed, clients trust me, and the office evolve into a culture of diligence over ego, I understood one final truth. Revenge is not about punishment. Revenge is about proving that intelligence, patience, and strategy are forces no arrogance can overcome. And those forces last far longer than pride or power ever will. Even now, I smile when I see someone who thinks control is only about noise, only about boldness, only about bluster. They don't know that the quiet ones are always watching, and that when the time comes, they do not need to raise their voice to win. I learned that lesson once, and I never forgot it. The story doesn't end with triumphs or trophies. It ends with clarity. It ends with understanding the subtle psychology of human behavior. It ends with power exercised silently, strategically, and permanently. Mark's downfall was not an exception, it was a consequence. And my victory was not for spectacle, it was for mastery. Because true revenge, the kind that echoes long after the event, doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be executed perfectly and observed quietly. And that is exactly what I did. Months rolled by and life at the office settled into a fragile calm. But calm is deceptive. Quiet tension lingered like a shadow stretching across every desk. People moved differently around me now, subtly deferential, careful with their words, aware that someone had orchestrated the invisible collapse of a once powerful figure. I noticed Mark's allies shifting nervously. They began second-guessing every decision, every move. Meetings that once bristled with aggression now moved slowly, cautiously. Someone would start a sentence, pause, check my expression, and adjust mid-thought. I didn't interfere, I didn't need to. The ripple effect of strategic patience was more potent than any confrontation. Then came the unexpected challenge. The company announced a new mentorship program. I was selected as a mentor for junior employees. At first, it seemed like an honor, a routine assignment, but I saw it as an opportunity. Opportunity not for revenge but for influence, for shaping the environment subtly, strategically, so arrogance and entitlement could never regain a foothold. I started meeting my mentees in the afternoons, not in a classroom or a formal setting, but quietly over coffee or during breaks. I listened more than I spoke. I asked questions that seemed casual but made them analyze their own choices, strategies, and behavior. Slowly they began thinking critically, seeing patterns, understanding consequences. One day Rachel, the junior manager I had spoken with months before, asked, "How did you stay so calm when Mark took the tickets?" I paused. The office was quiet. Only our table, 2 cups of coffee, and a faint hum of distant conversations. I looked at her and said softly, deliberately, "Because anger and resistance are temporary. Strategy is permanent. I didn't need to fight him. I needed to wait. And I waited until his own arrogance unraveled him." She frowned thoughtfully. "But wouldn't it have been satisfying to yell, to call him out?" I shook my head. Satisfaction from anger fades fast. Satisfaction from watching natural consequences unfold lasts a lifetime. Her eyes widened. I could see it, the realization hitting her. The power of patience, observation, and quiet intelligence. That moment I knew was the true continuation of my revenge. It wasn't just Mark anymore. It was teaching others to survive arrogance and cruelty without losing control. Meanwhile, the office environment continued evolving. Small missteps by former allies of Mark were no longer ignored. Errors were addressed not with public shaming, but with careful observation and strategic documentation. The culture shifted subtly, diligence was rewarded. Noise and aggression were tolerated less and less. And through all this, I remained silent, calm, untouchable. Then, the twist no one expected, Mark attempted to contact me personally. A message arrived on my work email, carefully phrased, neutral in tone. "I've been thinking about what happened. Perhaps I misjudged your capabilities. Can we meet to discuss things?" I read it once, twice, and then I smiled faintly. Not out of malice, but out of understanding. I knew exactly what he was trying to do: reclaim control, assert dominance, and reinsert himself into a world that had moved on without him. I didn't reply. Days passed, then weeks. His messages became more frequent, subtly desperate, each word carefully measured, attempting diplomacy. Flattery, subtle intimidation. Each one made me more certain that the revenge, the psychological, invisible, perfect revenge, was complete. He was unraveling quietly, trapped by the consequences of his own choices, unable to control a world that had moved on. At the same time, I began receiving recognition from higher management. Not public praise, not headlines, but quiet nods, invitations to lead strategic projects, requests for advice on handling complex situations. My influence grew silently, organically, through competence and foresight, not ego or arrogance. And the knowledge that Mark's attempts at influence were failing made every success more satisfying. Then came a test of patience. A competitor tried to lure me away with promises of higher salary, flashy titles, and control over teams I didn't even need. It was tempting on the surface: money, recognition, prestige, but I didn't react. I observed, analyzed, and declined with polite professionalism. The competitor didn't understand the lesson that Mark had unknowingly taught me: real power isn't about what you gain in a moment. It's about what you control and influence over time. Months turned into a year. Mark was no longer a shadow in my life, but the lessons lingered. His downfall had been total yet quiet, invisible to the casual observer. My revenge was complete, not with spectacle, not with confrontation, but with the slow, relentless application of patience, observation, and strategy. And then the final confirmation arrived. HR requested a formal recognition of my contributions to the company. This time it wasn't an envelope slipped onto my desk. It was a small, internal ceremony. No fanfare, no media, no public spectacle. Just my colleagues quietly acknowledging the intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight that had transformed the workplace culture. I accepted with humility, because the recognition itself was not the reward. The reward had been watching arrogance collapse under its own weight, teaching others the value of strategy over ego, and proving that patience can accomplish what anger never could. Even now, years later, I remember the day in the conference room, Mark smiling, tearing open the envelope with my name on it, and me nodding silently. That moment, that one simple, calm gesture, had set in a chain of events that reshaped not just my career, but the very culture around me. The story doesn't end with headlines, applause, or public revenge. It ends with mastery. Mastery of patience, observation, and strategy. Mastery of knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to let someone else unravel themselves. The final lesson is simple, cold, and unforgettable. True revenge is not seen, it is felt. It is experienced quietly, strategically, and permanently. And when executed correctly, it teaches more than punishment ever could. Even now I smile whenever someone underestimates the quiet ones. Because history proves, time and again, that the silent observer, the patient strategist, is always the one who wins. And as I sip my coffee in the quiet office, listening to the hum of productivity, the whispers of caution, the subtle respecting glances, I know one thing with absolute certainty. The revenge was perfect. And the lesson will last far longer than arrogance ever could. Months had turned into a year, yet the memory of the Super Bowl tickets lingered like a quiet ember, glowing in the background of my mind. It wasn't anger that kept it alive, it was clarity. That one moment, that silent nod in the conference room, had started a chain reaction far beyond Mark or the tickets. It had become a lesson in patience, observation, and strategic intelligence. One morning I arrived earlier than usual. The office was nearly empty, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. On my desk was a note, anonymous, typed neatly. Your patience has taught more than you know. Some are finally learning. I didn't react, not immediately. I held the note, read it twice, and then slid it into my drawer. That was the power of strategy. Letting actions speak louder than words. Whoever wrote it, I knew the message. My influence extended silently, shaping behaviors without direct involvement. Later that day, the first twist arrived. A new manager. Someone ambitious and slightly reckless joined the company. She carried herself with confidence bordering on arrogance, the kind that reminded me of Mark at his worst. Within hours, she began asserting control over processes she barely understood, dismissing the subtle contributions of her team. I watched quietly. I didn't confront her, didn't correct her immediately. Instead, I began a subtle game of observation, learning her patterns, her blind spots, her assumptions. Every mistake she made became data, every oversight a lesson waiting to unfold. Days later, during a crucial meeting, she presented a plan that looked impressive but was fundamentally flawed. The room waited for someone to point it out. Many hesitated. I leaned forward, calm, and asked one simple question. Have we considered the long-term client implications of this approach? The room went quiet. Her confident demeanor wavered. She stammered, trying to recover, but the flaw was undeniable. She looked around, realizing everyone had noticed her oversight. No one blamed me, no one cheered. The lesson had been taught quietly, strategically, without humiliation, without spectacle, but the impact was absolute. Later, she approached me privately, eyes cautious, voice low. I didn't expect you to notice. How do you always see things before anyone else? I smiled faintly. Patience, observation, and understanding consequences. That's all it takes. The words weren't meant as arrogance, they were meant as a lesson. The moment hung between us, subtle but powerful. I realized then that my revenge had evolved. It was no longer about Mark. It was about shaping the world around me, quietly, strategically, and visibly. The ripple effect of patience and intelligence was more satisfying than any confrontation could ever be. Weeks later, another twist arrived. Mark, thinking he could reinsert himself into the company's orbit, attempted to network with some of my colleagues. He sent polite, careful emails, attended industry conferences, even reached out to mutual contacts. But every attempt backfired subtly. People who had once been his allies now approached him cautiously, sometimes questioning his credibility without even needing my input. The consequences of his arrogance had become self-sustaining. I didn't intervene, didn't need to. The pattern had been set. Arrogance, when untempered by observation and strategy, inevitably leads to its own downfall. Mark was becoming a cautionary tale, whispered about quietly, with every misstep serving as evidence of his earlier hubris. Then came the unexpected recognition, formal this time. HR called me into a private meeting. Your contributions have gone far beyond expectations, they said, not just in project success but in shaping company culture. Your patience and strategic insight have created a model for leadership. I nodded quietly. Thank you. I've simply focused on understanding the consequences of actions and observing how patterns unfold. They smiled, impressed. But it wasn't the praise that mattered. It was the confirmation that patience, intelligence, and subtle strategy were now recognized as forces stronger than any arrogance or aggression. Outside the office, life continued. Industry events, client interactions, and networking offered temptations, opportunities for flashy displays of ego or rapid advancement. I declined them politely. My focus remained on the slow, deliberate shaping of influence. Quick wins are temporary, subtle, consistent strategy lasts. And then came the final twist, the one I had not anticipated but had predicted in theory. One of Mark's former allies, now attempting to rise, made a critical miscalculation. A report was falsified, a deadline overlooked. A small but significant ethical lapse, the consequences were immediate. The team noticed, HR intervened. The pattern repeated itself, almost like a script I had once observed unfold in Mark's downfall. It struck me then: true revenge. True strategy doesn't require constant action. Once the groundwork is laid, the environment itself carries the consequences forward. Patience sets the stage, arrogance triggers the collapse. I had learned that lesson with Mark. I was now witnessing it with others, a living demonstration of cause and effect in human behavior. By the end of the year, I sat in my office quietly reflecting. Colleagues respected me, mentees sought guidance. Clients trusted my judgment. The office culture had subtly transformed quiet diligence, strategic thinking, and patience were valued over loudness and aggression. And somewhere in the background, Mark's reputation remained a cautionary tale, whispered about but never openly confronted. I thought back to that day with the tickets. That silent nod in the conference room, the quiet acceptance of betrayal, the patient observation while Mark exposed his own flaws, all of it had led to this influence without conflict, victory without spectacle, strategy without ego. The final truth became crystal clear. True revenge is not about punishment, it's about proving quietly that intelligence, patience, and strategy are more powerful than aggression, arrogance, or entitlement. And the most satisfying victories are those unseen by the world, unfolding naturally, leaving consequences that last far longer than pride or power ever could. Even now, years later, I remember Mark's smile, the envelope, the disbelief in his eyes, and I realized that the revenge was never about him alone, it was about mastery, influence, and the quiet satisfaction of watching patterns unfold according to logic, patience, and calculated observation. Every decision I make now, every interaction I have, every opportunity I seize, carries that lesson forward. Not as vengeance, not as cruelty, but as demonstration. Patience and strategy always outlast arrogance and impulse. And as I look around the office, at colleagues navigating challenges, learning from missteps, growing under guidance I provide silently, I know this truth is eternal. Revenge is strongest when it is invisible. It is complete when it requires no confrontation. It is lasting when it teaches consequences and shapes behavior, rather than merely punishing. The silent strategist always wins, not loudly, not quickly, but with perfect timing, observation, and intelligence. And that, I realized, was far more satisfying than any ticket, any moment of public triumph, or any fleeting victory ever could be. By the time a full year had passed since the Super Bowl incident, the office had transformed quietly, subtly, but irrevocably. Arrogance no longer ruled meetings, and impulsive decisions were checked by careful observation. The culture of fear that Mark had fostered had been replaced by respect for patience, diligence, and strategic thinking, qualities that I embodied without claiming spotlight. It was a Tuesday morning when the final chapter began to unfold. I arrived at my desk as usual, coffee in hand, reviewing client emails. A subtle tension hung in the air, different from before, less fear, more anticipation. Word had circulated a major leadership decision would be announced today. I didn't rush, I didn't speculate, I watched. The first hint of the twist came when HR requested a private meeting. Not a casual discussion, but one in a small, windowless conference room. Inside sat the CEO, 2 senior managers, and an HR director. Their faces were calm but serious, a rarity in corporate bureaucracy. "We've reviewed the past year," the CEO began, voice measured, "and we've noticed significant changes in productivity, employee satisfaction, and client retention. These improvements are directly linked to the guidance and leadership demonstrated by one individual, you." I nodded silently, listening as expected. The room was tense, not because of the announcement, but because I had remained silent throughout, quietly orchestrating influence without fanfare. The CEO continued, "We're offering you a permanent leadership role overseeing a strategic department, autonomy in decision-making, mentorship of emerging leaders, and direct input on company-wide strategy." A small smile touched my lips. Not because of recognition, not because of power, but because the outcome validated every choice I had made: patience, observation, and subtle strategy. The office had learned what I already knew. True mastery comes from intelligence exercised quietly and without ego. Then came the final, unexpected twist. Mark, apparently desperate to re-establish influence in the industry, had attempted to apply for a consulting role at our company under a different division. His reputation preceded him, though not by my doing. The ripple effect of his previous arrogance, mistakes, and mismanagement had traveled silently across networks. The leadership team, unaware of the subtleties I had observed, initially considered his application. I was asked for feedback. I chose my words carefully. "Mark demonstrates technical skills," I said, voice calm, "but his history of prioritizing ego over process, and short-term advantage over long-term outcomes, suggests he may disrupt rather than contribute to strategic growth." The HR director nodded, CEO thoughtful. Within days, Mark's application was quietly declined. No confrontation, no dramatic firing, no public humiliation, just natural consequence executed through observation and timing. The revenge, in its purest form, had reached its conclusion. As I walked back to my office that day, a strange calm settled over me. The Super Bowl tickets, the stolen reward, the humiliation, it all felt distant now, almost trivial. What remained was mastery, clarity, and the knowledge that patience, intelligence, and quiet strategy yield results far beyond immediate gratification. Months later, a team of my mentees approached me. "You've changed how we think about work," Rachel said, eyes bright with admiration. "We used to compete blindly, argue loudly, and chase recognition. Now we consider consequences, observe carefully, and act strategically. You've taught us how to win without conflict." I smiled faintly, my gaze calm. Winning without conflict is not about avoiding challenge. It's about understanding the stakes, watching patterns, and letting others' actions reveal the truth. Power exercised silently is stronger than power shouted from the rooftops. The office had become a living testament to that principle. Mistakes by arrogant individuals no longer went unnoticed. Strategic foresight, mentorship, and observation were valued. Leadership emerged naturally from those who understood consequences, not from those who demanded attention. Then, the final moment of closure arrived. A colleague approached me one afternoon with a package, carefully wrapped, simple, anonymous. Inside were 2 tickets to the Super Bowl. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same event that had started this journey now offered a quiet acknowledgement of my growth, patience, and perseverance. I looked at the tickets and smiled, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for closure. The moment that once symbolized loss, humiliation, and injustice had now become a symbol of mastery, strategy, and patience. The lesson was complete. Mark, as far as I knew, had continued his attempts to regain influence elsewhere, but his reputation, quietly damaged, invisibly weakened, ensured that every step forward was haunted by his past mistakes. The lesson of the silent strategist, of the patient observer, was now permanent. As I walked through the office that evening, the lights dimming, colleagues packing up, I realized something profound. Revenge is never about spectacle. It is not about shouting, confrontation, or immediate gratification. True revenge is the strategic orchestration of consequences executed patiently, invisibly, and without ego. The world often rewards boldness, speed, and noise, but only temporarily. Those who underestimate intelligence, patience, and observation ultimately sow their own downfall, and those who understand timing, strategy, and subtle influence hold a power far greater than any momentary triumph. I reflected on that day 1 year ago when Mark had smiled, taken the tickets, and assumed victory. My silence had been my greatest weapon, my observation my greatest ally, and now, looking around at the office culture, the transformed environment, and the lessons quietly absorbed by those I had mentored, I realized the revenge had evolved into something much larger than myself. It had become a lesson in human behavior, in consequences, in the enduring strength of strategic patience. Arrogance had been exposed, ego had faltered, and intelligence, exercised quietly and consistently, had triumphed. The Super Bowl tickets, once a symbol of betrayal, now symbolized mastery. They were not a reward for anger or retaliation, but for understanding, patience, and the subtle execution of strategy over time. And the ultimate lesson, the one that would endure long after Mark, the tickets, or any single event, was revenge is strongest when unseen. Power is permanent when exercised with patience and intelligence. Arrogance collapses on its own, and the silent observer, who acts only when the time is perfect, always wins. I tucked the tickets into my drawer. I didn't need to attend the game, I didn't need applause. The victory, quiet and complete, belonged to me forever. The office lights dimmed, and I looked out the window at the city below. Everything had changed, yet nothing had been loud about it. And in that quiet, calculated victory, I understood something profound. Life rewards those who understand strategy, consequences, and patience far more than it rewards noise, anger, or immediate gratification. The silent strategist is the true master of any battlefield, corporate or otherwise. And with that, I walked back to my desk, calm, confident, and untouchable, knowing that the greatest victories are those that unfold invisibly, shaping reality without anyone ever realizing how they came to be. The revenge was complete. The lesson was eternal, and the silent strategist had won.